In Texas, under Penal Code Section 22.01, assault causing bodily injury to a family member is classified as a Class A misdemeanor, punishable by up to 1 year in jail and fines up to $4,000. For repeat offenders or cases involving serious bodily injury, charges escalate to third-degree felonies, with sentences ranging from 2 to 10 years in state prison. The Texas Family Code further allows for protective orders that can be issued within 24 hours of a domestic violence report, providing immediate legal protection for victims. These laws exist because every 20 minutes, someone in Texas calls law enforcement for help with domestic violence. But laws only work when someone is brave enough to ask for help. And sometimes that someone is only 7 years old. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Texas hill country, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep purple that seemed to set the horizon ablaze. Outside, Big Joe's roadside diner, just off Highway 290 near Fredericksburg. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a row of gleaming Harley-Davidsons lined up like chrome soldiers, standing at attention. The Hells Angels chapter from Austin had stopped for their weekly ride, boots kicked up on the weathered picnic tables, laughter echoing across the quiet stretch of ranch land that rolled endlessly toward the distant hills. Inside, the smell of fresh brewed coffee mixed with the scent of leather and motor oil, creating an atmosphere both welcoming and slightly dangerous. The bikers were the kind of men that made families grip their children a little tighter when they passed by on the highway. Tattooed arms told stories in ink and scar tissue. Scarred knuckles spoke of fights won and lost. Vests adorned with patches carried meanings most people would never understand and probably didn't want to. But beneath those intimidating exteriors were men who'd seen enough darkness to recognize it in others, and enough light to know when someone desperately needed saving. The sound of gravel crunching under small, running feet shattered the peaceful rhythm of their Sunday afternoon. Every head turned toward the commotion, conversations dying mid-sentence. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, came tearing across the parking lot from the direction of the small grocery store next door. Her red dress whipped behind her like a distress flag, catching the golden light. Her dark hair flew wild and tangled around her face. Tears carved clean lines down her dirt-streaked cheeks, and her voice cracked with the kind of raw terror that freezes blood in veins. "Please," she screamed, her small fist pounding desperately against the nearest biker's leg. "They're beating my mama. Please, you have to help her." The raw desperation in her voice silenced everything. Even the distant traffic on the highway seemed to fade. A couple of truckers near the gas pumps turned their heads, watching but not moving. An elderly couple emerging from the grocery store froze in place. But only the bikers responded. The man she'd grabbed was Cole Gunner Matthews, a 42-year-old veteran whose eyes had seen too many battlefields, both overseas in dusty foreign lands and here at home in trailer parks and broken families. Standing 6'4" with a frame built from hard labor and harder years, he possessed massive hands that had dealt violence when necessary, but knew how to be gentle when it mattered most. He dropped to one knee instantly, his weathered hands steadying the trembling child with surprising tenderness. "Where's your mama, sweetheart?" Gunnar asked, his gravel-rough voice surprisingly soft, stripped of its usual commanding edge. The little girl, Sheila M. Hall, though he wouldn't learn her name until later, could barely speak through her tears. But she pointed frantically toward a cluster of mobile homes, barely visible beyond the tree line, about half a mile down a dirt road that disappeared into the shadows. "Back there," she sobbed, her small chest heaving with breathless panic. "Him and his friends, they came back. They're hurting her bad. Nobody will help. I ran and nobody would stop, and I thought nobody was going to help her." Gunnar's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his salt and pepper beard. He stood slowly, his 6'4" frame casting a long shadow across the parking lot that seemed to stretch toward the distant trailers like a promise of incoming justice. Behind him, 7 other bikers had already stood, reading the situation in his posture, in the child's tears, in the weight of the moment. "Brothers," Gunnar said, his voice carrying the weight of command, earned through years of military service and even more years leading men who needed purpose. "We ride. Now." The words hung in the air for only a heartbeat before chaos became coordinated action. Within seconds, 8 bikers were on their feet, moving with the practiced precision of men who'd ridden together long enough to function as a single unit. Engines roared to life with a collective thunder that shook the windows of the diner and rattled the weather-beaten sign hanging above the door. The sound rolled across the ranch land like approaching storm. Big Joe himself, a former Marine who'd run the diner for 30 years and had seen just about everything the highway could throw at him, stepped out onto the porch. He saw Gunnar kneeling beside the crying child, saw the other bikers mounting their machines with grim purpose, and he simply nodded once. He'd known these men for years, had served them coffee, and listened to their stories. They weren't the monsters the world thought they were, not even close. Gunnar scooped Sheila up with the same care he'd once used carrying wounded soldiers from battlefields, settled her on the seat in front of him, and wrapped his heavy leather jacket around her tiny frame. It swallowed her completely, but it was warm and smelled like safety, like cigarettes and leather and something indefinably protective. "Hold on tight, little warrior," Gunnar told her, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to pump through his veins. "We're gonna get your mama. You understand me? We're not gonna let anything happen to her." Sheila nodded against his chest, her small fingers gripping the front of his vest like a lifeline. The convoy of motorcycles tore out of the parking lot in a formation that would have made any military unit proud. Engines screaming, chrome flashing in the dying sunlight. They thundered down Highway 290, then veered hard onto the unpaved road Sheila had pointed toward. Dust clouds billowed behind them like smoke from dragon's breath as they raced toward the mobile home park, toward violence, toward a woman who'd given up hope that anyone would come. Behind them, the diner parking lot stood empty and quiet once more. But everyone who'd witnessed the moment, the truckers, the elderly couple, Big Joe standing on his porch, knew they'd just seen something important, something that would matter. They just didn't know yet how much it would change everything. The sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, swallowed by the Texas evening. racing toward a destiny that would redefine what it meant to be a hero in a world that had forgotten how to recognize them. The convoy moved like a single organism down Highway 290, 8 Harleys in tight formation, their engines creating a symphony of controlled power that echoed off the limestone hills. Dust clouds billowed behind them, turning golden in the fading sunlight, marking their passage like a war banner unfurled across the Texas landscape. Sheila clung to Gunner's back, her small arms wrapped around his waist, her face pressed against the leather of his vest, as the wind whipped past them with force that would have been terrifying under any other circumstances. But right now that wind meant speed, and speed meant hope. Gunner's hands were steady on the handlebars, but his mind was anywhere but calm. The Texas landscape blurred past, rolling hills dotted with live oaks, ranch fences stretching toward infinity, the kind of beauty that should have been peaceful but felt haunting in this moment. Because he'd been here before. Not physically, but emotionally. He'd lived this nightmare 13 years ago when his sister Emily had called him from a hospital in San Antonio, her voice barely recognizable through the swelling, telling him her boyfriend had lost his temper again. He'd been deployed in Afghanistan then, unable to get emergency leave, unable to do anything but promise he'd be home soon, unable to save her before that boyfriend's temper escalated one final fatal time. Not this time, Gunner thought, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. Not on my watch. Never again. The highway gave way to gravel, and the convoy veered hard onto an unpaved road that wound through increasingly dense scrub brush. The landscape changed quickly here, prosperity giving way to poverty in the space of a quarter-mile. They entered a mobile home park that looked like hope had packed its bags and left decades ago. Weather-beaten trailers surrounded by rusted chain-link fences, yards littered with broken toys and abandoned cars slowly being reclaimed by weeds and time. This was the kind of place where screams went unanswered, because everyone had learned the hard way that asking questions only brought trouble to your own doorstep. Neighbors who might have been good people once had been ground down by circumstance until survival meant keeping your head down and your mouth shut. Forgotten dreams and broken promises seemed to seep from the very ground, creating an atmosphere of despair so thick you could almost taste it. The sound of violence led them directly to trailer number 47. Even through the thin aluminum walls, they could hear everything. A woman's desperate cries, raw and primal, the kind of sound no human should ever make. A man's slurred shouting, words too distorted by rage and alcohol to be understood, but unmistakable in their venom. The sickening sounds of flesh hitting flesh, furniture overturning, glass breaking, and underneath it all, male laughter, casual and cruel, like this was entertainment instead of someone's life being destroyed. The bikers' faces hardened in unison, transforming from weekend riders into something far more dangerous. This wasn't their first intervention. They'd done wellness checks before, pulled women from bad situations, stood between victims and abusers until law enforcement arrived. But the sounds coming from that trailer spoke of an escalation that demanded immediate action. Gunner brought his bike to a halt 30 feet from the trailer, the sudden silence after the engine cut almost deafening. He carefully lifted Sheila and passed her to Marcus Doc Williams, a 45-year-old former Army medic whose gentle hands had saved more lives than most doctors would in a career. Doc had stitched up wounded soldiers in field hospitals, talked down suicidal veterans at 3 in the morning, and could assess an injury with a single glance. "Stay with Doc," Gunnar told Sheila, his voice firm but reassuring. "We got this. Your mama's gonna be okay." Doc wrapped his arm around the trembling child and moved her behind the bikes, positioning his body between her and the trailer. "Eyes on me, little one," he said softly. "Don't watch. Just listen to my voice." Gunnar turned back to his brothers. No words were needed. Hand signals flew between them with military precision. 5 fingers pointing to the front door, 3 gesturing toward the back of the trailer. Cover all exits. Tommy St. Rodriguez, the chapter president, was already on his phone, dialing 911 with one hand while pulling out a second phone to start recording with the other. They'd learned the hard way that documentation was everything when the law arrived. 5 bikers approached the front door in a spread formation that would have made any tactical team proud. 3 more disappeared around the back, moving silently despite their size and the gravel beneath their boots. The sounds from inside were getting worse. Deborah's scream pierced the air, followed by the crash of shattering glass and more of that horrible laughter. Gunnar stood before the door, and suddenly he wasn't in Texas anymore. He was in that San Antonio hospital room, looking at Emily's broken face, listening to her make excuses for a man who would kill her 6 months later. He was at her funeral, watching their mother collapse beside the casket, knowing he'd failed to protect someone he loved. He was making a promise over her grave. "Never again will I stand by. Never again will I let someone suffer alone." This was personal now. This had always been personal. He took a deep breath, made eye contact with each of his brothers. In their faces, he saw the same grim determination, the same understanding. They'd all lost someone. They'd all failed to act quickly enough once. They all carried ghosts that demanded redemption through action. Tommy nodded once, phone still recording. 911's on the way. We're clear." "On 3, Gunnar said quietly. 1, 2, 3. The door exploded inward like a storm of leather and fury, hinges giving way with a screech of tortured metal. Gunnar was through first, his size filling the doorway, blocking out the fading sunlight and casting the trailer's interior into sudden shadow. The scene that greeted them would be burned into their memories forever. Deborah Whitehall was cornered against the kitchen counter, one arm raised defensively in front of her face. Her left eye was already swollen shut, turning the color of raw meat. Blood trickled from her split lip, and more blood stained the front of her torn shirt. She looked small and broken, a woman who'd been beaten down in every way possible until she'd stopped believing rescue was real. Standing over her was Ray Sutton, a mean-looking man whose prison tattoos told a story of violence and time served. His breath reeked of cheap whiskey, even from across the room. His fist was raised for another strike, frozen mid-swing by the sudden intrusion, his face twisted in a mask of rage and entitlement. Behind him, 2 of his buddies stood with phones out, recording and laughing like they were watching a boxing match instead of witnessing felony assault. One of them was actually live streaming, the phone screen showing viewer comments scrolling past with sickening enthusiasm. Time seemed to freeze. Ray's fist hung in the air. Deborah's eyes went wide with something that might have been hope or might have been terror. Sometimes they looked the same. The friends' laughter died in their throats as they registered 5 massive bikers filling the doorway and blocking any escape. Gunner's voice cut through the silence like a blade, quiet and deadly and absolutely certain. Step away from the lady. Before we continue with what happened next in that trailer, I need to ask you something. This story, this moment of real courage, deserves to be shared with everyone who still believes in heroes. If you're watching without subscribing, you're missing stories like this every week. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and leave a comment telling us about a time someone stood up for you. Your support helps us share more stories that restore faith in humanity. Ray Sutton spun around, his face twisting from predatory focus to rage-fueled confusion in the span of a heartbeat. His fist, still raised and ready to deliver another blow to the woman cowering behind him, slowly lowered as his alcohol-soaked brain processed the impossible reality standing in his doorway. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled, trying to inject authority into a voice that cracked with sudden uncertainty. Gunner took one deliberate step into the trailer, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire space. His voice, when it came, was deadly calm, the kind of quiet that preceded violence, that every predator recognized in another predator. Your worst nightmare, if you don't back up right now. The standoff lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt eternal. 5 bikers filled the doorway and the narrow space inside the trailer, their presence overwhelming and absolute. 3 abusers, suddenly realizing they'd graduated from victimizing the helpless to facing men who wouldn't flinch. Deborah remained frozen against the wall, her one good eye flickering between terror and something that might have been hope. An emotion she'd abandoned so long ago she barely recognized it anymore. Ray's 2 friends stepped forward from their positions near the couch, trying to look tough, trying to reclaim the power dynamic that had shifted so dramatically. They were younger than Ray, probably mid-20s, with the kind of swagger that came from never facing real consequences. That was about to change. Ray made his mistake then, the one that would seal all of their fates. He lunged forward with the whiskey bottle still clutched in his right hand, swinging it toward Gunner's head with the wild haymaker of a drunk man who'd terrorized women and small men his entire life, but never faced someone who actually knew how to fight. Gunner's response was pure, trained instinct. His hands shot up with the speed and precision of someone who'd disarmed insurgents in desert combat zones, catching Ray's wrist mid-swing with a grip like a steel trap. He twisted with practiced efficiency, using Ray's own momentum against him, and the bigger man went crashing to the floor with a heavy thud that shook the trailer's thin walls. The bottle flew from Ray's hand, shattering against the stained linoleum in an explosion of glass and remaining whiskey. The chemical smell mixed with the copper scent of blood and the sour stench of fear sweat, creating an atmosphere of violence and consequence. The domino effect was instantaneous. Ray's 2 friends rushed forward with the stupidity of men who'd never learned when to quit. They made it exactly 2 steps before 4 more bikers materialized from behind Gunner, like shadows gaining substance. Tommy came through the door with Marcus right behind him. From the back of the trailer, the other 3 bikers who'd covered the rear exit appeared in the narrow hallway, effectively trapping everyone inside. Every exit was blocked. Professional containment, executed with military precision. The friends found themselves face to face with men who outweighed them, outmatched them, and carried themselves with the confidence of people who'd seen real combat and survived it. There was no excessive force, no unnecessary violence, just overwhelming presence within seconds. Both men were subdued and pressed against the wall, their phones clattering to the floor, their bravado evaporating like morning dew under the Texas sun. "Nobody moves," Tommy St. Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the authority of a chapter president who'd commanded men in worse situations than this. He held up his phone, the screen still recording everything. "Cops are already on their way." Ray, still on the floor with Gunner's boot planted firmly between his shoulder blades, started to protest. "You got no right. And here's the beautiful part," Tommy interrupted, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone. "Your little recording session just became evidence against you. See your buddy there?" He gestured to one of Ray's friends, whose phone lay on the floor with its screen still glowing. He was live streaming this whole thing. The assault, the threats, everything. We saved the footage and sent it to law enforcement before we even walked through that door. The realization hit Ray's friends simultaneously. Their own stupidity had become their downfall. What they'd thought was entertainment, content for social media likes and comments, was now irrefutable evidence of felony assault. The modern age had just prosecuted them before they'd even been arrested. Behind them all, Deborah's legs finally gave out. The relief was overwhelming, washing over her like a physical force. She slid down the wall, her body shaking violently as sobs of gratitude and shock tore through her. Years of abuse were written on her face. Not just tonight's beating, but hundreds of others, layers of trauma stacked like geological strata. This wasn't the first time Ray had done this, but the bikers would make damn sure it was the last. Gunner's expression softened immediately. He secured Ray with a knee to the back, enough pressure to keep him down, but not enough to injure, and gestured for one of his brothers to take over. Then he approached Deborah with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal, hands visible, movements slow and deliberate. "Ma'am," he said gently, dropping to one knee beside her. "You're safe now. Can you walk?" Deborah nodded weakly, though her body was still trembling so hard she could barely control her limbs. Gunner helped her stand, supporting most of her weight with one arm while keeping her steady. Behind them, the other bikers maintained control of the 3 perpetrators with professional efficiency. No violence beyond the necessary restraint, no rage, despite what they felt, just controlled, purposeful protection. "Let's get you outside," Gunner said softly. "Get you some fresh air." He led Deborah through the trailer door and into the fading sunlight. After the darkness and violence inside, the evening air felt like a baptism. It was symbolic, that emergence from hell into light, from captivity into freedom, from terror into safety. Fresh air filled her lungs. Freedom trembled in her limbs. Safety, that foreign concept, began to tentatively take root. The moment Sheila saw her mother, She broke free from Doc's protective grip and ran. The reunion was a collision of desperate love, mother and daughter crashing together, arms wrapping tight, voices breaking into quiet, tearful sounds that needed no word. They clung to each other like survivors of a shipwreck, and in many ways, that's exactly what they were. The bikers formed a protective circle around them without being asked, without discussion. A wall of leather and loyalty that nothing would penetrate. They stood with their backs to the mother and daughter, facing outward like sentinels, silent guardians who'd seen too much evil to ever let it go unanswered again. In the distance, sirens began to grow louder, their wail cutting through the evening air like a promise of justice. Inside the trailer, Ray had found his voice again, though it came out as desperate threats rather than commands. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat. "I got friends. You're gonna regret this." Gunnar turned his head slightly, his voice carrying back through the open door. "I know exactly who I'm messing with. A coward who beats women and thinks he's tough. And I know who I'm protecting. Someone who deserves better than you." The red and blue lights began filtering through the trees, painting the mobile home park in alternating colors of authority and consequence. 2 Hill Country sheriff's cruisers pulled up, their sirens cutting off as they assessed the scene. The lead deputy who emerged was Sheriff Kate Morrison, a no-nonsense woman in her mid-40s who'd run this county with fairness and strength for 8 years. She saw the bikers, saw the woman and child they were protecting, saw the 3 men contained inside the trailer, and understanding dawned on her face immediately. "Gunnar," she said, shaking her head with something between exasperation and respect. "Should have known. Just happened to be in the neighborhood, Sheriff," Gunnar replied with the ghost of a smile. She almost smiled back. "Sure you were." It wasn't their first interaction. The Hells Angels chapter and the Sheriff's Department had a history, not of conflict, but of cooperation on community issues, toy drives, veteran support, missing person searches. Kate Morrison knew these men weren't the monsters the patches suggested. She knew exactly what kind of men they really were. Sheriff Kate Morrison moved through the scene with the professional efficiency of someone who'd worked hundreds of domestic violence calls over her career. Her eyes took in everything. The 3 men subdued inside the trailer, not a mark on them beyond Ray's self-inflicted tumble to the floor. The woman outside, clearly the victim of brutal assault, her face already swelling into a mask of purple and black. The child clinging to her mother, traumatized, but physically safe. The bikers standing in formation around them, cooperative and calm, their body language speaking of protection rather than aggression. No signs of vigilante justice. Everything done by the book. She pulled out her notepad and approached Deborah with the gentle firmness of someone who knew how to handle victims in shock. "Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Morrison. I need to get your statement while it's fresh. Can you tell me what happened here tonight?" Deborah's account came out in trembling fragments, her voice breaking every few words. She told them about Ray Sutton, her ex-boyfriend, who'd beaten her regularly during their 2-year relationship that had ended 3 years ago, about the restraining order she'd filed in 2022 after he'd put her in the hospital with broken ribs and a punctured lung, about his arrest and conviction for aggravated assault, the 18-month sentence that should have kept him away longer. "He got out 3 weeks ago," Deborah whispered, her good eye leaking fresh tears. "I didn't even know until he showed up today. I've been careful. I moved twice, changed my phone number. I don't know how he found me." Sheriff Morrison's jaw tightened. She'd seen this too many times. The system's failures written in bruises and broken bones. "Your address is supposed to be protected," she said quietly. "We'll investigate how he accessed that information. That's another charge." Ray's friends, it turned out, were more than just spectators. They'd helped Ray track Deborah down by following Sheila from school one afternoon. They'd participated in today's assault by blocking the door when Deborah tried to run, by encouraging Ray, by recording it like entertainment. Conspiracy charges would stick to them like tar. Deputy James Chen, Morrison's partner, was already downloading the live stream footage from the phones they'd confiscated. "Sheriff, you need to see this," he called from inside the trailer. The video was damning. Clear audio of Ray's threats, visual evidence of him striking Deborah multiple times, his friends laughing and making comments about teaching her a lesson. The footage had been saved by the bikers before the perpetrators could delete it. Tommy had screen recorded the live stream and sent it directly to dispatch, along with the 911 call. Even if they'd destroyed every phone in that trailer, the evidence was already preserved in multiple locations. Doc was documenting Deborah's injuries with the precision of his medical training. Split lip, swollen eye, bruised ribs, at least 2 of them cracked from the feel of them. Possible concussion from where her head had hit the wall. Defensive wounds on her forearms where she'd tried to protect herself. But worse than the fresh injuries were the old ones, scars on her shoulders from cigarette burns, the way her left wrist sat at a slightly wrong angle from a fracture that hadn't healed properly, the faded discoloration along her jaw from previous beatings, evidence of years of abuse written on her body like a history no one should have to carry. "Ma'am, you need to go to the hospital," Doc said gently. "Those ribs need x-rays, and you should be monitored for the concussion." Deborah shook her head violently, panic flashing across her face. "No hospitals. He found me at the hospital last time. I just want to go somewhere safe, please." Sheriff Morrison was reading Ray his rights, while Deputy Chen secured him in handcuffs. The charges were stacking up like cordwood. Assault causing bodily injury to a family member, elevated to a 3rd-degree felony because of his prior conviction and the serious nature of her injuries. Violation of a protective order. Parole violation, since any arrest while on parole meant automatic revocation. Terroristic threat, based on the recorded statements where he'd threatened to kill her if she ever tried to leave him again. His friends were being cuffed as well, charged with assault through complicity. Failure to report a crime they'd witnessed, and harassment. All 3 men were looking at serious prison time. Ray himself was facing anywhere from 2 to 10 years, and with his record, he'd serve most of it. By now, neighbors had emerged from their trailers, drawn by the sirens and the commotion. People from the grocery store had driven over. Even a few patrons from Big Joe's diner had followed at a distance, curious about what the bikers had ridden toward so urgently. They gathered at the edges of the scene, watching in stunned silence, witnessing something most of them had never seen in this place where screams were routinely ignored. Someone actually helping. The first applause started with a single person, an elderly woman who lived 3 trailers down, who'd heard Deborah's screams so many times before and hated herself for not calling the police, for being too afraid. She stepped forward slowly, her weathered hands coming together in a clap that sounded like absolution. "Thank you," she called out, her voice cracking. "Thank you for doing what the rest of us should have done." Others joined in, the applause building slowly at first, then louder, rolling across the mobile home park like thunder. Recognition of courage, acknowledgement that they'd witnessed something important. Some people were crying. Others stood with their hands over their hearts. The sound echoed across the Texas plains, carrying into the darkening sky like a prayer of gratitude. Gunnar knelt beside Deborah and Sheila, his large frame somehow making them feel safer rather than threatened. "You're coming with us," he said simply. "We'll find you somewhere safe tonight, and tomorrow we'll make sure you have everything you need." Deborah looked at him through her one good eye, confusion and gratitude warring on her face. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "You don't even know us." Gunnar's jaw worked for a moment before he answered. "Because nobody should face hell alone. And that little girl was brave enough to ask for help when most adults wouldn't have." Sheila, who'd been silent since the reunion with her mother, finally spoke. She looked up at Gunnar with eyes that seemed far too old for her 7 years. "Are you an angel?" The bikers exchanged glances, several of them looking away quickly, suddenly finding the ground very interesting. Gunnar's response was thick with emotion he usually kept buried. "No, sweetheart. Just someone who knows what it's like when nobody comes." Sheriff Morrison finished processing the scene and approached the group. "There's a women's shelter in Fredericksburg," she said, pulling out a card with the information. "Safe haven. Director's name is Maria Castellanos. I'll call ahead. Let her know you're coming. They'll have space for you tonight." She paused, looking at the bikers. "You offering to escort them?" Tommy stepped forward. "Yes, ma'am. If that's acceptable to you." Morrison considered for a moment, then nodded. "Unofficial protection detail. I'll notify the shelter you're coming with them. And gentlemen, thank you. This one would have ended differently without you." The patrol cars pulled away with Ray and his friends secured in the back seats, heading toward the Hill Country Jail where they'd await processing and arraignment. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people returning to their trailers with something to talk about for months to come. The bikers prepared their motorcycles while Doc helped Deborah and Sheila into his truck. He kept it for situations where bikes weren't practical. The sun had set completely now, and the Texas sky was painting itself in stars, thousands of them visible in the darkness far from city lights. A new chapter was beginning for this broken family, and a story that would change everything was just getting started. The Safe Haven Women's Shelter sat on a quiet street in Fredericksburg, deliberately nondescript, a single-story building that could have been a medical office or small business. That anonymity was intentional. Security measures were everywhere once you knew to look. Cameras covering every entrance, reinforced doors with electronic locks, windows that didn't open from the outside. The location itself was confidential, kept from public databases and search engines. Women came here when they'd run out of everywhere else to run. Maria Castellanos met them at the security entrance, a woman in her early 50s whose dark eyes held both compassion and steel. She'd built this shelter from nothing 15 years ago, after her own daughter had been killed by an abusive partner. That tragedy had transformed her from a quiet teacher into a warrior for the vulnerable. When she saw Tommy stepping out of his truck, recognition lit her face. "Tommy St. Rodriguez," she said, a slight smile breaking through her professional demeanor. "I should have known." "Maria," Tommy replied, embracing her briefly. "We've brought you someone who needs your protection." They'd worked together before. Fundraisers, emergency transports, security details when particularly dangerous abusers were still on the loose. Maria knew these men weren't the threat. They were the solution. The intake process took nearly 2 hours. Paperwork, documentation, medical forms that Doc helped fill out with his clinical precision. Deborah's history unfolded in heartbreaking detail. 5 years of escalating abuse, 3 previous attempts to leave that had failed when Ray found her each time. Emergency room visits she'd lied about, claiming she'd fallen or walked into doors. Police reports that went nowhere because she'd been too terrified to follow through with prosecution. System failures stacked on system failures, each one sending her back into Ray's control until she'd stopped believing escape was possible. "This time is different," Maria said firmly, her hand covering Deborah's. "This time, he's going to prison. And this time, you're not alone." While the adults processed paperwork, Sheila sat in the corner with Amanda Chen, a child advocate who specialized in trauma. Amanda had set her up with paper and crayons, understanding that sometimes children processed horror better as through art than words. Sheila drew picture after picture, motorcycles in formation, a little girl in a red dress, men who looked scary but were labeled helpers in careful crayon letters. The adults watching felt their hearts simultaneously breaking and healing. This child had been forced to grow up too fast, to become her mother's savior, to run for help when every adult around them had looked away. But she was resilient in the way children could be when they finally felt safe enough to start processing trauma. The bikers refused to leave. As the night deepened toward midnight, they established shifts in the parking lot. 3 men, all always present, rotating every few hours. "Just in case Ray has friends we don't know about," Gunnar explained when Mariah questioned their vigil. "Won't be the first time someone's tried to finish what they started." At midnight, Maria brought them coffee in a large thermos, along with sandwiches from the shelter's kitchen. She sat with them on the tailgate of Doc's truck, the Texas night wrapped around them like a blanket, studded with stars. "Why do you do this?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "I've seen you help, 6 families now? 7? 11, Tommy corrected quietly. "If you count the ones we helped get to shelters in Austin and San Antonio." Gunnar stared into his coffee cup, silent for a long moment. Then, in the way that midnight conversations sometimes pulled truth from places usually kept locked, he started talking about Emily. His sister had been 26 when she died at the hands of her boyfriend in 2014. The abuse had gone on for 2 years. hidden beneath long sleeves and fake smiles, explained away with excuses that Gunnar, deployed in Afghanistan, had wanted to believe because the alternative was unbearable. The system had failed her repeatedly, restraining orders that were just paper, police who could only act after the violence, never before, a shelter that had been full when she had finally worked up the courage to ask for help. Gunnar had been overseas when his mother called to tell him Emily was gone. He'd carried that guilt for 10 years, the weight of not being there, of not seeing the signs, of not protecting someone he loved. "Every woman I help is Emily getting another chance," he said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely showed. "Every kid like Sheila is a chance to stop the cycle before it steals another life. It's not redemption. Nothing can bring her back. But it's prevention. It's making sure what happened to my sister doesn't happen to someone else's." Maria's eyes were wet. She reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "You're not just bikers," she said. "You're a brotherhood of protectors." She shared statistics that every advocate knew by heart. 1 in 3 women experience domestic violence at some point in their lives. Her shelter was always at capacity, turning away women because there simply wasn't room. Resources were stretched impossibly thin. Law enforcement could only do so much, bound by laws and jurisdictions and the limitations of a system that reacted to violence rather than preventing it. "Community action makes the difference," Maria said. "People like you, who step up when it matters. That's what saves lives." As the night wore on, they began planning tomorrow. Deborah would need an apartment, something affordable, but in a safe neighborhood. Job prospects. Maria mentioned that Deborah had been a licensed vocational nurse before Ray had isolated her from work. But her credentials had lapsed after 3 years of not practicing. School enrollment for Sheila at a campus with good counseling services, mental health support for both of them, and the legal proceedings against Ray that would require Deborah's testimony. Tommy was already making calls despite the hour. The Hells Angels had a network that stretched across Texas. Brothers who owned apartment complexes, who managed hospitals, who worked in legal aid. This wasn't their first rescue, and they'd built an underground railroad of sorts for domestic violence survivors. Housing contacts, employment connections, lawyers willing to work pro bono. Stories emerged as they talked. The single mother in Austin they'd helped relocate after her ex-boyfriend violated parole. The grandmother in San Antonio raising her daughter's children after domestic violence had orphaned them. The teenager in Houston they'd extracted from a human trafficking situation. 11 families, 11 second chances, 11 lives redirected toward hope instead of horror. Dawn broke over the hill country with the kind of light that made the limestone hills glow gold. The bikers were still there, standing watch, when Deborah emerged from her assigned room. It was the first real sleep she'd had in months. Medicated, yes, but also genuinely safe. She'd slept knowing Sheila was protected, knowing Ray was behind bars, knowing that for the first time in 5 years, tomorrow might not bring violence. When she saw them still in the parking lot, something inside her broke open. "You stayed?" she whispered. Fresh tears streaming down her battered face. "All night, you stayed?" Gunnar straightened from where he'd been leaning against his motorcycle. "We're not going anywhere until you're truly safe." he said simply. Before they left, there was a formal exchange that felt almost ceremonial. Each biker gave Deborah and Maria their personal phone numbers, written on cards that also included the shelter's information. "You call any time, day or night," Tommy instructed. "Doesn't matter what it is. You need a ride. You need someone to check your apartment before you go in. You need someone to sit with you at court. You call." They arranged weekly check-ins, established a schedule for apartment hunting, committed to being there for every step of the legal process. "You're family now," Gunnar told Deborah, his hand gentle on Sheila's shoulder. "That's what this means. You're under our protection, and that doesn't end." As they rode away at sunrise, 8 motorcycles disappearing into the morning light, their promise hung in the air like morning mist, real, tangible, unbreakable. This was only the beginning. The video surfaced on TikTok 36 hours after the rescue, and it changed everything. Someone had taken the grocery store's security footage, grainy but clear enough, showing Sheila in her red dress running across the parking lot toward the bikers. They'd spliced it together with witness phone videos, capturing the moment she collapsed against Gunnar's leg. The bikers mounting their motorcycles in formation, engines roaring as they tore away toward danger. Audio from Ray's own live stream provided the sickening soundtrack. Threats, violence, cruel laughter. Then finally, the reunion footage. Deborah and Sheila clinging to each other in the parking lot, surrounded by a protective circle of leather-clad guardians. The editing was simple, but powerful. The caption read, "Little girl runs to scary bikers for help. What they did next will restore your faith in humanity." Within the first hour, it hit 100,000 views. By morning, it had been reposted across every platform: Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit. Mainstream media picked it up by afternoon. Local news stations ran segments titled, "Bikers Rescue Woman from Domestic Violence." National outlets followed. By the evening news cycle, the story had exploded into millions of views, comments multiplying faster than anyone could read them. The response was immediate and divided. Supporters flooded the comments. "This is what real men look like." They didn't ask questions. They just acted. Stop judging people by their appearance and start judging them by their actions. These men are heroes, period. But skeptics pushed back hard. Hell's Angels are criminals, don't be fooled. Probably staged for publicity. They're a gang, not heroes. The prejudice ran deep. Decades of media portrayal creating assumption that no single act of kindness could easily overcome. Then defenders who actually knew the truth started responding. They shared Tommy's chapter history, annual toy drives that distributed thousands of gifts to underprivileged children every Christmas, charity rides, raising money for veteran suicide prevention. Security details provided free for domestic violence survivors during court proceedings. Community cookouts in low-income neighborhoods where they gave away food and school supplies. The complex reality of biker culture emerged in those comment threads. Not all patches meant the same thing. Not all clubs operated the same way. Some chapters had criminal elements, yes, but others, like Tommy's, had evolved into something different. A brotherhood built around protection rather than destruction, redemption rather than rebellion, Media requests came flooding in. News stations called Big Joe's Diner so frequently that Big Joe finally unplugged the phone. Reporters tracked down Gunner through DMV records and showed up at his house. Interview requests piled up in Tommy's email inbox. The bikers declined them all. "This isn't about us," Gunner told the fifth reporter who cornered him at a gas station. "This is about Deborah and Sheila. And it's about every woman suffering in silence who needs to know that asking for help isn't weakness. It's courage. You want to interview someone? Interview domestic violence advocates. Interview shelter directors. Interview survivors. We just did what anyone should do." But while the bikers tried to deflect attention, unexpected consequences were already rippling outward. A stranger in California, someone who'd never met Deborah or Sheila, set up a GoFundMe titled, "Help the Mother and Daughter Saved by Bikers." $5,000 appeared in the first day. By the end of the week, it had reached 50,000. The money was placed under Maria Castellanos' management at the shelter, every penny designated for Deborah and Sheila's fresh start. Apartment deposit, furniture, medical care, whatever they needed to rebuild their lives. The second unexpected consequence was more complicated. The Hells Angels chapter was suddenly flooded with messages from other victims. Women in similar situations, trapped and terrified, reached out through social media, through the shelter, through any channel they could find. "If you helped her, can you help me?" became a constant refrain. The bikers were overwhelmed but determined. They couldn't physically rescue everyone, but they could connect women to resources. Tommy created a network, shelter contacts across Texas, lawyers specializing in protective orders, therapists who offered sliding scale fees. Sometimes they did wellness checks, showing up at a woman's workplace just to let an abuser know she wasn't alone anymore. The network expanded organically, brother chapters across the state joining the effort. A documentary filmmaker from Austin named Sarah Chen reached out with a different request. She wanted to tell the full story, not just the dramatic rescue, but the aftermath. The real, unglamorous work of helping someone rebuild. The impact on domestic violence awareness. With Deborah's permission, she proposed following the family for 6 months, also documenting the bikers as they responded to other calls. After much discussion, they agreed. This could amplify the message beyond one viral video. But success always brings backlash. Ray's family emerged on social media, claiming the bikers were vigilantes who'd assaulted their son without cause. His lawyer threatened charges, calling it unlawful restraint and assault. Social media defenders of abusers crawled out of dark corners with their victim-blaming rhetoric. She probably deserved it. Why didn't she just leave? Women lie about abuse for attention. The epidemic of victim-blaming threatened to overwhelm the positive message. Sheriff Kate Morrison shut it down with a public statement released through the Hill County Sheriff's Office. After thorough investigation, I can confirm that the individuals who intervened followed every applicable law. They called 911 immediately, used only necessary force to protect a victim from ongoing assault, and cooperated fully with law enforcement. Mr. Raymond Sutton, however, violated multiple laws including assault, protective order violation, and parole conditions. The evidence is overwhelming. This was not vigilante justice. This was citizens protecting someone in immediate danger, which Texas law explicitly permits. The statement was shared 50,000 times in 24 hours. Then Deborah made her decision. Despite fear, despite trauma, she agreed to an interview with the local news station. They filmed her at the shelter, her face partially hidden to protect her location, her voice trembling but growing stronger as she spoke. "They saved my life," she said, looking directly into the camera. "They saved my daughter's life. I want every woman watching this to know, if you're suffering, if you're trapped, if you think there's no way out, ask for help. Someone will come. Maybe it won't be bikers. Maybe it'll be a neighbor, a coworker, a stranger at a grocery store. But someone will come. You are not alone. You are worth saving." Her courage sparked a revelation cascade. Within hours, women across Texas, across the country, started sharing their own stories of abuse and survival using the hashtag #AskForHelp. The tag trended nationally. Domestic violence hotlines reported call volumes increasing by 40%. Other motorcycle clubs contacted Tommy, wanting to join the cause. Within 2 weeks, Bikers Against Domestic Violence was forming as an official organization, with chapters coordinating across state lines. A national conversation had begun, but for Gunnar, Tommy, and their brothers, it remained intensely personal. The millions of views, the media attention, the movement they'd accidentally sparked. None of it meant as much as the thank you note Sheila had drawn in crayon, or the moment Deborah had slept through an entire night without nightmares. It was still about that one little girl in a red dress who'd been brave enough to run for help. It was still about Emily, who'd never gotten the chance to ask. And all the women like her who deserved better than the world had given them. The viral moment would fade eventually. Trends always did. But the impact would ripple forward, touching lives they'd never meet, saving people they'd never know, proving that sometimes the scariest-looking people had the biggest hearts. And sometimes all it took was one act of courage to change everything. 3 weeks after that desperate afternoon, Deborah and Sheila stood in the doorway of their new apartment, a small 2-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood where children rode bicycles on sidewalks and neighbors actually knew each other's names. The space had been furnished entirely through donations and community generosity. A couch that still smelled new. A kitchen table where they could eat meals without fear. Curtains that let in sunlight without exposing them to danger. Sheila's room had been painted pink at her request, the first choice she'd been allowed to make about her own space in years. A new bed with sheets covered in butterflies. A closet full of clothes that hadn't been selected to avoid triggering someone's rage. Toys donated by the Hells Angels annual Christmas drive, given early because this child had already waited long enough for good things. It was the physical manifestation of a new beginning. The Sunday tradition began that first weekend. 8 motorcycles lined up outside the apartment complex every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock sharp. At first, the neighbors were concerned. Nervous phone calls to the property manager, whispered conversations behind curtains. Who are these people? Should we call the police? Then understanding dawned. These weren't threats. These were guardians. Coffee and donuts appeared on Deborah's small front lawn, shared between bikers and slowly emerging neighbors who learned the story and wanted to help. Sheila would run out in her pajamas, squealing with delight, climbing onto Gunner's motorcycle to pretend she was riding while he held her steady and made engine noises that sent her into fits of giggles. Deborah's healing journey was neither linear nor easy. PTSD therapy twice weekly with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a trauma specialist who'd worked with domestic violence survivors for 20 years. Processing years of accumulated trauma, learning that raised voices didn't automatically mean violence, that mistakes didn't require punishment, that trust could be rebuilt one careful brick at a time. Flashbacks still ambushed her. Triggers appeared in unexpected places. The smell of whiskey, the sound of boots on stairs, even certain songs on the radio that Ray had played. But progress was visible to those paying attention. Smiles became more frequent. Laughter, tentative at first, began to emerge naturally. Hill Country Regional Hospital offered Deborah a nursing position despite her lapsed credentials. The director of nursing, herself a domestic violence survivor from 15 years earlier, implemented a retraining program specifically designed for healthcare professionals returning after extended absence. The bikers helped with child care during her classes, Sheila doing homework at Big Joe's Diner, while Deborah studied pharmacology updates and new treatment protocols. Doc tutored her on medical advances she'd missed, his gentle teaching style helping rebuild her professional confidence. "You never lost your skills," he told her during one late-night study session. "Just your chance to use them. Now you have it back." Sheila enrolled at Fredericksburg Elementary, where the principal personally ensured she had access to special counseling services. Her teacher, Mrs. Patricia Conquo, was briefed on her trauma, but treated her like any other student, which was exactly what Sheila needed. Her classmates knew nothing of her story. They just saw a happy girl who drew motorcycles during art time and always had interesting answers during show and tell. Art therapy continued helping her process everything she'd witnessed. Each drawing showed progression. Early pictures filled with dark colors and scared faces gradually giving way to brighter scenes, smiling people, hope rendered in crayon. The legal proceedings loomed like a storm cloud. Ray's trial was scheduled for late November, and Deborah would have to testify. The terror of facing him again, even across a courtroom, even with him in shackles, threatened to undo months of healing. But the prosecution's case was devastatingly strong. Video evidence, documented injuries, witness testimony from neighbors who'd heard screams for years. Sheriff Morrison personally guaranteed Deborah's safety, and the bikers offered to fill the courtroom gallery, a wall of silent support. Meanwhile, the GoFundMe exceeded $100,000. The community organized a benefit concert at the county fairgrounds, local musicians donating their time, with proceeds split between Deborah's family and Safe Haven Shelter. The bikers organized security for the event, their presence ensuring everyone felt safe. New friendships formed organically. Other shelter residents who'd moved into permanent housing began connecting with Deborah, their shared experiences creating bonds that outsiders couldn't fully understand. A support group emerged, meeting weekly at Maria's shelter, women who understood the particular fear of checking your rearview mirror constantly, of flinching at sudden movements, of rebuilding identity after it had been systematically destroyed. The bikers expanded their protection to the entire group. People noticed changes in Gunner, too. He seemed lighter somehow, more purposeful. Emily's memory was being honored through action rather than drowning in guilt. He'd started therapy himself, processing the survivor's guilt he'd carried for 10 years, finding meaning in rescue work that gave his pain purpose. "Maybe I couldn't save her," he told Tommy one evening, "but I can save others. Maybe that's enough." As Thanksgiving approached, the bikers planned something special, a dinner at Big Joe's Diner for Deborah, Sheila, and the 11 other families they'd helped over the past 2 years. Big Joe donated his space. The community provided food. The place where it all started would become a place of celebration. Family was being redefined, not by blood, but by choice and commitment. The Hill Country Criminal District Court stood imposing against the November sky, its limestone facade speaking of justice and consequence in equal measure. Deborah arrived in borrowed professional clothes, a navy blazer and slacks provided by Maria, because she owned nothing suitable for the most important day of her life. Her hands shook despite the medication Dr. Martinez had prescribed for anxiety, but her jaw was set with determination that had been forged in survival. Catherine Wu, her victim advocate, stayed at her side through security, through the metal detectors, through the walk-down corridors that seemed to stretch forever. In the gallery, 15 bikers sat in clean vests, their presence a wall of silent support. They'd shown up at 7 in the morning to claim the front rows, ensuring Deborah would see friendly faces when she needed courage. Ray Sutton was led in wearing an orange prison jumpsuit and shackles, the metallic clink of chains announcing his entrance. His eyes were still defiant, that particular arrogance of abusers who believed they'd ultimately escape consequences. He tried to stare Deborah down, to reclaim the power he'd once held through intimidation. Gunner's movement was subtle, just a slight shift forward in his seat, his considerable frame blocking Ray's line of sight. Ray's attention shifted immediately, recognition and fear flickering across his face. The message was clear without a word spoken. You touch her again, even with your eyes. You deal with us. Ray looked away. Assistant District Attorney Marcos Reyes presented the prosecution's case with methodical precision. The video evidence played on screens throughout the courtroom. First the grocery store footage of Sheila running for help, then the damning live stream that Ray's friend had broadcast. The courtroom audibly gasped at the violence, at the casual cruelty, at the entertainment these men had made of destroying another human being. Deborah's medical records told their own story. Emergency room visits spanning 5 years. Each injury explained away with increasingly implausible accidents. Previous police reports documented a pattern of escalation. Pushing that became slapping, that became punching, that became life-threatening assault. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, an expert on domestic violence cycles, testified about how abusers systematically broke down their victim support systems, isolating them until escape seemed impossible. The defense attorney, a tired-looking man named Robert Chen, who'd clearly taken this case for the paycheck rather than conviction, attempted character assassination. "Isn't it true that you provoked Mr. Sutton with constant criticism?" he asked during his opening statement. that he was under the influence and didn't understand the severity of his actions, that this was a tragic mistake rather than intentional harm. The jury's faces showed they weren't buying it. When Deborah took the stand, her voice trembled initially, barely audible, even with the microphone. But as she detailed 5 years of systematic abuse, her voice grew stronger. She described escape attempts that Ray had thwarted by tracking her phone, by threatening her family, by convincing her that no one would help. She talked about her fear for Sheila's life, how Ray had started directing his rage toward the child, how Deborah had known it was only a matter of time before he seriously hurt or killed them both. The morning he returned, she said, her voice breaking, I thought we were going to die. I'd run out of options, out of places to hide, out of hope. She looked directly at the jury. My daughter saved my life by being brave enough to ask strangers for help. She was 7 years old, and she had more courage than most adults I've known. The cross-examination was brutal. Chen attacked, with the victim-blaming questions that made advocates' blood boil. Why didn't you leave sooner, Mrs. Hall? Deborah's response was powerful in its simplicity. Because he said he'd kill me if I tried, and I believed him. He'd almost succeeded before. Why didn't you call police if you were so afraid? I did. 3 times. He was arrested twice, released both times within 24 hours. The system couldn't protect me from him. The restraining order was just paper. He violated it the day after he got out of prison. What was I supposed to do? Keep calling until he finally killed me? The courtroom fell silent. Gunner was called as a witness, describing the rescue with professional precision. No embellishment was needed. The facts spoke for themselves. Chen tried to paint the bikers as vigilantes seeking glory, but Sheriff Kate Morrison's testimony demolished that narrative. They followed every applicable law. They called 911 immediately upon arrival. They used only necessary force to prevent ongoing assault. They cooperated fully with law enforcement. These men potentially saved Mrs. Hall's life while following proper protocol. Mr. Sutton, conversely, violated every law designed to protect victims. The moment that sealed Ray's fate came when the prosecutor played the live stream footage in its entirety. Ray's own voice filled the courtroom, slurred with alcohol and venom, threatening to kill Deborah if she ever embarrassed him like this again. His friends' laughter provided soundtrack to violence. Their commentary, teach that bitch a lesson. She had it coming, turned abuse into entertainment. Several jurors looked physically ill, the defense team visibly deflated. Closing arguments crystallized everything. Prosecutor Reyes stood before the jury with quiet intensity. This case is about a man who believed he owned another human being, who believed he had the right to hurt her, to control her, to terrorize her and her child, who would have killed her if not for the intervention of good Samaritans who chose to act when others looked away. Texas law is clear. Domestic violence is a crime. Violating protective orders is a crime. Assault causing bodily injury is a crime. Raymond Sutton committed all of these, and his own video evidence proves it beyond any doubt. The defense offered weak rebuttals. Mistake, alcohol-induced impairment, stress from difficult circumstances, excuses that fell flat against the mountain of evidence. The jury deliberated for only 90 minutes, remarkably quick for a case with multiple charges. The bikers waited in the hallway, a silent vigil. Deborah paced until Catherine gently guided her to a bench. In a child-friendly room down the hall, Sheila drew pictures with the victim advocate, her therapy through art continuing even here. When the bailiff called them back, the courtroom felt electric with tension. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts," the jury foreman announced. Deborah's tears came immediately, relief and validation pouring out in sobs she tried to muffle. The bikers' celebration was restrained, slight nods, hands clasped briefly, but their satisfaction was evident. Ray erupted in rage, screaming threats at Deborah, even as deputies moved to restrain him. "This isn't over. You hear me? This isn't." Judge Patricia Reynolds's gavel cracked like thunder. "Mr. Sutton, you are now being charged with additional counts of threatening a witness and contempt of court. Take him away." The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, but everyone knew Ray was facing 8 to 10 years minimum. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed, cameras, microphones, reporters shouting questions. Deborah stood at the microphone Catherine had arranged, her voice steady now. "Justice was served today, but the real heroes were the men who didn't look away when I needed help." The cameras panned to the bikers standing behind her. Gunner had his arm around Sheila, who clutched her latest drawing, a courthouse with a one rising behind it. "No comment," Gunner said when reporters pushed microphones toward him. "We just did what anyone should do." They walked away from the cameras, through the crowd, toward their motorcycles, parked in formation. The victory was quiet, personal, and deeply meaningful. Justice had been served, but more importantly, Deborah and Sheila were finally, truly safe. We're 6 months into this journey now, and if this story has meant something to you, I need to ask for your help. Stories of real courage and transformation only reach people when you share them. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now and hit the notification bell so you never miss these moments that remind us humanity is still beautiful. Your like, your comment, your share, they all matter more than you know. Spring had returned to the Texas hill country, painting the landscape in wild flowers, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, creating a tapestry of color that seemed almost impossibly beautiful. 6 months had passed since that desperate afternoon when a little girl in a red dress had run for help. So much had changed. Big Joe's Diner still stood in the same spot off Highway 290, its weathered sign still creaking in the wind. But the people, they had been transformed. The Sunday tradition continued without fail. At 9 a.m. sharp, motorcycles lined up in the parking lot, though now there were often 20 instead of 8. The network having grown organically as word spread. Deborah and Sheila were already inside, helping cook breakfast alongside Big Joe. Deborah now held the head nursing position at Hill Country Regional Hospital, saving lives daily with the skills she'd reclaimed. Sheila thrived in 3rd grade, an honor-roll student whose teachers marveled at her resilience. Both had healed, though neither would ever forget. Ray Sutton had been sentenced to 8 years in state prison, eligible for parole in 5, but facing extensive conditions if he ever got out. A permanent no-contact order ensured he could never legally approach Deborah or Sheila again. His two friends each received 3 years. Justice had been served, though the bikers remained vigilant. Abusers like Ray had a way of finding supporters even behind bars. The ripple effect had exceeded anyone's expectations. In just 6 months, the Hells Angels chapter had helped 15 other families escape domestic violence situations. The network had expanded across Texas, then into neighboring states. Bikers Against Domestic Violence became an official nonprofit with chapters in 6 states, conducting fundraising, awareness campaigns, and direct interventions. A movement had been born from one little girl's courage. The documentary When Angels Wear Leather premiered at the Austin Film Festival to a standing ovation. Deborah and Sheila walked a red carpet. People who'd never sought spotlight suddenly thrust into it, handling the attention with grace. The film showed their journey alongside stories of other families the bikers had helped. Its impact on domestic violence awareness immediate and profound. The Q&A session afterward ran 2 hours past schedule because so many survivors wanted to share their own stories. On a crisp autumn morning, back at Big Joe's after the premiere, Sheila approached Gunnar with something hidden behind her back. Her shy smile had replaced the terror that had once defined her face. She'd grown taller, healthier, happier, the physical manifestation of safety and love. "Mr. Gunnar," she said formally, "I made you something." She pulled out a drawing, carefully colored in crayon with the precision of a child who'd spent hours getting it exactly right. It showed a little girl in a red dress standing beside a massive biker, a row of motorcycles stretching behind them. At the top, in her improving handwriting, "My hero." Below, "Thank you for teaching me brave people are real." Gunnar's weathered face struggled with emotion he usually kept buried. He stared at the drawing for a long moment, his throat working. Finally, he folded it carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket, right over his heart where Emily's memorial patch had hung for 10 years. "That's the best thing anyone's ever given me," he said quietly. "I'll keep it with me every ride, every road. You hear me?" Sheila nodded, beaming, then threw her arms around his waist in a hug that said everything words couldn't. The other bikers watched silently, several clearing their throats and suddenly finding their coffee fascinating. Tommy muttered something about damn allergies while wiping his eyes. Everyone knew this was what it was all about, not the patches or the bikes or the reputation, but moments like this, lives saved, families protected, of winning. Deborah stood addressing the crowd that had gathered, community members, press, supporters, the families they'd helped. The diner was packed beyond capacity, people spilling into the parking lot. "6 months ago, I thought my life was over," she began, her voice steady and strong. "I thought my daughter would grow up without a mother. I thought monsters always won." She paused, looking at the bikers. These men, these scary bikers, they taught us different. They taught us that heroes exist, that courage means showing up, that family isn't just blood, it's who stands beside you when hell comes calling. The community had transformed alongside them. The neighborhood that once feared the bikers now embraced them. Children ran up for high fives. Parents invited them to birthday parties. The local church had featured them in a sermon about good Samaritans, about not judging by appearance but by action. Stereotypes shattered, truth revealed, humanity transcended appearance. The women's shelter had expanded, funded by donations that continued pouring in. A new wing was named Gunner's Haven over his protests. Maria overruled him. "You saved Emily through saving others. Honor that." Emily's picture hung in the lobby beneath a plaque. "In memory of those we couldn't save, for those we still can." Gunner had cried when he saw it. Tears finally shed, finally healing. Statistics showed measurable impact. Domestic violence reports up 40% because survivors felt safe reporting. Emergency shelter capacity doubled. Response time to crisis calls decreased. 3 major arrests of repeat offenders. Community awareness transforming culture. Real change, not just good intentions. That morning, Sheila sat on Gunner's motorcycle, a too-big helmet wobbling on her small head, learning about engines and maintenance and responsibility. "Bikes are freedom," Gunner taught her. "But freedom means protecting those who can't protect themselves. Like you protected Mama," 8-year-old Sheila said with wisdom beyond her years. "Exactly like that." Then the full circle moment arrived. A new family walked into the diner, a woman with a fresh black eye, holding a toddler's hand, looking around nervously. She saw the bikers and fear flickered across her face. Sheila noticed immediately. She walked over, no hesitation. A survivor guiding another survivor. "Don't be scared," she said gently. "They're the good guys. They saved my Mama. They'll save yours, too." The woman's tears came instantly. Gunner was already standing, already approaching. "Ma'am, do you need help?" The cycle began again. But this time, the chain of courage was unbroken, passed from survivor to survivor, proving that healing could become helping, that being saved could inspire saving others. As the sun set over the Texas hill country, motorcycles lined up outside the diner where it all started. Deborah served coffee, laughing at someone's joke. Sheila played with the bikers' grandchildren. The new woman and her child were being welcomed into the fold. Community thrived. Love won. Heroes became exactly who they needed to be. Not despite their past, but because of it. If you know someone suffering in silence, be brave like Sheila. If you see someone who needs help, be brave like Gunner. If you think you can't make a difference, remember, one little girl changed everything. One group of scary bikers saved lives. One community transformed. One story at a time. National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear leather vests, and sometimes they're 7 years old in a red dress.